This photograph was taken in 1940 Chicago, Illinois. The man behind the camera was an American soldier. The German female prisoners of war who witnessed this photograph were amazed by the greatness of America. What follows is her recollection based on photographs, letters, and recorded memories. If this story echoes something from your own family, we invite you to share it with us. And if preserving these stories matters to you, you're welcome to subscribe and continue listening the next video.
June 18th, 1944. Chicago, Illinois. The train slowed long before it stopped. I felt it through the floorboards, first a deep vibration that climbed up my calves and settled in my stomach. The wheels screamed against the rails, metal protesting metal, and then there was a smell so sudden and so thick it felt like a hand over my mouth. Hot, fat, iron. Something coppery I would later understand was blood. When the door slid open, no one shouted. No rifles were raised. No dogs barked. Instead, a wall of sound poured in steam. Hissing chains, clanking engines, idling whistles calling to one another across vast distances. It was not chaos. It was rhythm. I stepped down onto the platform with the other women, my boots touching ground that felt strangely alive beneath me. The air shimmered. Smoke rose in slow columns, not from fires or ruins, but from stacks, tall, orderly, unhurried. Above them, the sky was a pale summer blue, unmarred by contrails or flak. This was America. I had imagined something else. Barbed wire. Barracks. Silence broken only by orders. Instead, what stood before us was motion. Beyond the platform, rail lines spread outward like veins, dozens of them, each carrying something somewhere else. Boxcars rolled past loaded with cattle grain crates stamped with stenciled letters I could not yet read. Men moved with purpose, not urgency. Overalls darkened with grease, shirts rolled at the sleeves. Faces calm. They did not look at us as enemies. Most did not look at us at all. A woman beside me whispered in German, "Where are we?" I did not answer because I did not know how to explain what I was seeing. We were escorted forward, not pushed, not hurried past a fence that seemed almost symbolic compared to what I had expected. Beyond it stretched an expanse so wide my eyes could not take it in at once. Animals moved in long, slow currents guided by men who used gestures more than words. Cranes lifted carcasses with mechanical patience. Conveyors carried meat upward, inward, onward. Everything moved forward. The smell grew stronger as we walked. It clung to my clothes, my hair, the back of my throat. It was not the smell of decay. It was the smell of work being done at scale, of bodies turned into nourishment, of nothing wasted. In Germany, by 1944, we spoke in whispers about food. We planned meals like military operations. Butter was a memory. Meat was a rumor. Even in offices, even behind desks, hunger was always present, a quiet companion. Here, hunger seemed impossible. A guard, a young man with a soft Midwestern accent, noticed my hesitation. He slowed his pace so I would not stumble. "Watch your step," he said, pointing at a slick patch on the ground. "Get slippery." I looked down. The ground was stained dark, worn smooth by years of feet and wheels. I nodded, embarrassed by how easily my legs shook. No one laughed. We were led to the edge of a raised platform overlooking the stockyards. From there, the full picture emerged. The scale of it struck me like a physical blow. This was not a factory. It was a city within a city, operating according to rules invisible to an outsider but clearly understood by those inside it. Animals arrived alive and left as boxes. Trains arrived empty and departed heavy. Men worked in shifts seamlessly replacing one another as if the work itself never slept. I had typed reports for the Wehrmacht. I had filed requisitions, counted units, tracked shortages. I had believed I understood logistics. I had not. Somewhere behind us, a whistle blew sharp and clear. Instantly, a section of the floor cleared. Another group moved in. There was no shouting, no confusion. Everyone seemed to know where to be without being told. "This feeds the army," one of the women murmured. It fed more than that. I could see it now. This fed cities. It fed allies. It fed people I would never meet. And it did so without spectacle, without ceremony. This I realized with a tightening chest was the other front of the war. Not Normandy, not Stalingrad, but here. Chicago. In Germany, we had posters. slogans, marching songs. We had spoken endlessly of willpower, of sacrifice, of destiny. But standing there, watching 1,000 small actions combine into something unstoppable, I understood that willpower alone could not build this. This required trust. Systems. People who believed that tomorrow would come and prepared for it accordingly. A memory surfaced uninvited: my mother at the kitchen table in Hamburg, cutting bread thinner and thinner, pretending not to notice when my younger brother asked for seconds. The way she smiled too quickly, the way she turned away. Here, a man wiped his hands on a rag and took a sip from a metal canteen. Another lit a cigarette and leaned against a railing unhurried as a train thundered past behind him. No one was starving. One of the guards explained something to our interpreter. I caught fragments, numbers, schedules, destinations. Words like daily shipment, regular. The interpreter turned to us and said, "This runs all the time. All the time. Even as bombs fell elsewhere. Even as men died across oceans. Even as we stood here prisoners in a foreign land." I waited for the cruelty to reveal itself, for the trick, for the moment when kindness would turn sharp, but nothing happened. The men kept working. The machines kept moving. The guards kept their distance. A realization crept in slow and unwelcome. This was not designed to break us. It did not need to. I thought of the speeches I had heard, the warnings drilled into us about American weakness, American excess, American decay. Looking out over the stockyards, I saw excess, yes, but disciplined, directed, purposeful. This was not indulgence. This was capacity. A woman near me began to cry softly, her shoulders shaking. She did not cover her face. No one told her to stop. The guard simply looked away, granting her the privacy of indifference. As we were led back toward the train, the smell followed us. It would stay with me for days, perhaps forever. Not the smell itself, but what it represented. Power without rage. Order without fear. An enemy who did not need to prove anything. I had expected imprisonment. What I encountered instead was a country at work. And for the first time since my capture, I felt something more unsettling than fear. I felt doubt. The smell followed us back onto the train. It clung to our clothes and hair soaked into wool and skin as if it had chosen us. Even after the doors closed and the engine lurched forward, I could still taste it, fat and metal heat and motion. No one spoke at first. The wheels found their rhythm again, and Chicago slid away behind us, still breathing, still working. Only when the city noise faded did the fear begin. It arrived quietly the way hunger does, without warning, without mercy. A woman across from me pressed her knees together and stared at her hands. Another crossed herself, though I had never seen her pray before. Someone whispered my name, then stopped as if afraid even that might be overheard. "They will use us," a voice finally said. Low, certain. No one asked who they were. We all knew. For years, we had been taught that America did not fight wars the way we did, that they hid behind machines, that they turned human beings into numbers, into fuel. Standing inside that moving train with the image of endless rails and conveyors still burning behind my eyes, the lesson felt suddenly real. "They don't need people," another woman said. "Not when they have all that." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a spoon aluminum dull from use. She had carried it since France, ever since someone told her prisoners were sometimes not fed. Her fingers wrapped around it until her knuckles turned white. I understood the gesture. Objects had weight now. Proof of existence. If you could hold something, you still mattered. Across from her, Liesel slipped her hand beneath her blouse and checked the place where she hid her photograph. She did it quickly, instinctively, like touching a wound to make sure it had not reopened. I knew the picture without seeing it, her parents standing stiffly in front of their house, her father in his Sunday coat, her mother's hair pinned back too tightly. A world that no longer existed. The train rocked gently, carrying us farther from the stockyards and deeper into uncertainty. I closed my eyes and immediately the images returned, not of America but of Germany, as it had been when I left it. Hamburg under clouded skies. Windows taped in neat crosses. Factories silent, not because they had finished their work, but because there was nothing left to feed them. I remembered standing in line for bread with ration cards folded so many times they felt soft as cloth. The way people stopped talking about tomorrow. In Germany, by 1944, production meant improvisation. Broken machines cannibalized to keep others alive. Trains that did not arrive. Orders that contradicted one another. We spoke of sacrifice, but what we lived was scarcity. In Chicago, there had been none of that. The terror crept in when we tried to understand what that meant for us. They don't waste, someone said, not food, not time, and not people another finished. That was the thought we could not escape. That a system so vast and efficient had no room for hesitation for mercy for individuals who slowed it down. That we were about to be absorbed into something that did not care who we were. I had seen machines before. Typewriters, filing systems, radios. But what I had seen in the stockyards was something else entirely. A living mechanism built by choice, not necessity. And that frightened me more than any shouted threat. The train stopped briefly at a siding. We could hear other trains pass, heavy, fast, full. Each one felt like a reminder that the world was moving forward without us. When it started again, a sob broke loose somewhere near the door. No one tried to silence it. I thought of the briefings we had been given before my capture, of the films shown in darkened rooms Americans portrayed as faceless operators of destruction, of factories turning out death at the push of a button. We had been told that surrender meant becoming raw material. Looking back now, I understand why those stories had felt convincing. Faced with the scale of what America could do, we needed to believe it was inhuman. Otherwise, we would have to admit something far more frightening, that it was built by ordinary people who believed in it. A guard passed down the aisle checking on us. He paused when he saw one woman trembling, her breath shallow and fast. He crouched slightly so his face was level with hers and spoke softly. I did not catch the words, but I saw the effect. Her shoulders eased. She nodded. When he moved on, the woman looked up confused. He asked if I was cold. She said as if the idea itself did not make sense. We exchanged glances, unsure how to respond to that. The fear did not leave. It only changed shape. Instead of waiting for a blow, we waited for a purpose to be assigned to us. Work, perhaps. Labor, we could understand. But what kind of work could match what we had seen? How could hands compete with belts and hooks and steel? They won't need us long, someone whispered. Just until we wear out. I pressed my palms against my thighs, grounding myself in the feel of fabric and bone. I told myself not to imagine what came next. But the mind does not listen when fear speaks. I imagined endless shifts, noise without pause, being swallowed by a process too large to notice loss. I imagined disappearing quietly, efficiently, without resistance. And yet, threaded through the dread, there was something else. A question. If this country could organize itself so completely that no one went hungry, that waste was an offense, not a habit, why would it need to destroy us? The thought felt dangerous, almost disloyal to the fear that had kept me alive. I pushed it away. It was easier to believe we were expendable than to accept that everything we had been taught might be wrong. The train slowed again, this time for longer. Through the small window, I saw open landfields, silos, roads stretching straight into the distance. Not ruins, not rubble. Just space. We gathered our few belongings. The spoon disappeared back into a pocket. The photograph was pressed once more, then hidden. Breaths were drawn, held released. Whatever waited for us would not announce itself with cruelty. Of that, I was suddenly certain, and that more than anything made my heart race. Because if the danger was not in what they would do to us, then it was in what we would have to unlearn. We expected the cruelty to begin immediately. That was the strange thing about fear. It trains you to wait for pain, so when nothing happens, the waiting itself becomes unbearable. When the trucks finally stopped and we were told to step down, my body braced for shouting, for hands pushing at my back for the familiar sharpness of humiliation. None of it came. The ground was hard-packed dirt, warm from the sun. Heat rose in visible waves, and with it came a noise I had never heard so clearly before, not the roar of engines this time, but the constant layered sound of work, hammering somewhere distant, a motor turning over and settling into a steady hum, metal clinking against metal. It was loud, yes, but not angry. I flinched anyway. A man standing nearby noticed. He was not a guard, no rifle, no helmet. Just a worker in a sweat-darkened shirt, his sleeves rolled to the elbows. He held a paper cup in one hand and watched me with mild concern, as if I were someone who had wandered too close to something unfamiliar. "You okay?" he asked. I did not answer. I was not sure what the correct response was supposed to be. He glanced toward the guards, then back at me. "Water," he said, holding out the cup. I hesitated. My first instinct was suspicion. Gifts were never free in war, but my throat burned, and the day pressed down on us with its weight. I took the cup with both hands, careful not to touch his fingers. The water was cool, clean. I swallowed too quickly and had to stop myself from coughing. He smiled, not broadly, not performatively, just a small adjustment of the mouth like someone satisfied that a simple problem had been solved. Then he turned and went back to his work without another word. I stood there holding the empty cup, confused by the absence he left behind. A few steps away, one of the guards, a woman younger than I expected, approached an older prisoner whose jacket hung crookedly from her shoulders. The woman gestured gently, then stepped closer and tugged the fabric into place, fastening a button the prisoner's fingers could not manage. The prisoner froze, eyes wide, as if expecting the touch to turn violent at any second. But the guard's hands were quick, efficient, practiced. When she finished, she nodded once and stepped back. There she said, "Better." The word settled between them, ordinary and unremarkable. The prisoner murmured something like thanks, though it came out barely audible. I watched these moments stack quietly on top of one another, each too small to be called mercy, too mundane to be called strategy. There was no announcement, no explanation of principles. No one told us we were being treated well. They simply did it. As we were led past a row of machinery, the noise rose suddenly. Metal on metal, steam-venting engines cycling. Several of us recoiled at once instinctively. The sound carried memories of bombings of factories hit and burned, of nights when the ground shook and the sky glowed orange. A man walking ahead of us glanced back. He raised his voice just enough to be heard, his tone steady, almost conversational. "You'll be fine," he said. "It's just loud. Not dangerous, not temporary, just loud." The sentence lodged itself somewhere deep inside me. It was not reassurance meant to calm a frightened enemy. It was the kind of comment someone makes to a coworker or a child startled by thunder, an acknowledgement of discomfort, not a warning of harm. For the first time since my capture, I realized that no one here seemed interested in what we represented. They did not see uniforms or ideology or threat. They saw people out of place navigating something unfamiliar. I had been taught that kindness when it came from an enemy was always a trick, that it was meant to weaken resolve, to soften resistance. But what I was witnessing did not feel calculated. It felt habitual. This, I began to understand, was how these people treated one another when there was work to be done. The routines unfolded without ceremony. Water breaks appeared where heat gathered. Instructions were given plainly, without insult. When someone stumbled, the response was practical: move her out of the way. Make sure she was all right. Continue. No one made a point of our captivity. It was simply a fact, like the weather. Later, as we sat in a shaded area, waiting to be moved again, I listened to the conversations drifting past us. Talk of schedules, of shipments, of families back home. Someone complained about a machine that kept jamming. Someone else joked about missing dinner. Life uninterrupted. I thought of the speeches I had typed back in Germany, the carefully chosen words about sacrifice and endurance. How everything there had been framed as exceptional, as temporary, as justified by destiny. Here, nothing was framed at all. People worked, ate, rested, and returned to work. The system did not pause to congratulate itself for functioning. That was perhaps the most disarming thing of all. A guard explained our next steps through the interpreter, her voice neutral, factual. She referenced rules where we could go, what was expected of us, what would not be tolerated. There was no threat attached, only clarity. I recognized something in that tone that I had not felt in years, trust that rules mattered because people believed in them. Later, I would learn the name of the document that governed our treatment. I would hear it referenced by officers and administrators alike, not as a shield against punishment, but as a matter of course. It was not spoken with pride or defensiveness. It was simply assumed. At the time, I did not have the language for it. I only knew that the wall I had carried inside me, built from warnings and hatred and fear, had developed its first crack. It was not shattered, not yet. But every small gesture widened it. A cup of water, a button fastened, a sentence spoken without contempt. I realized then that no one was trying to convince us of anything. There were no posters proclaiming values, no speeches about morality. The kindness we encountered did not demand gratitude. It did not ask to be remembered. It existed because this was how things were done, and that more than any show of force unsettled me. Because propaganda can be argued with. Violence can be resisted. But routine decency, quiet, consistent, unremarkable, leaves no clear enemy to fight. As the day wore on and the noise settled into a background hum, I felt something unfamiliar rise in my chest. It was not relief. It was not hope. It was the uncomfortable awareness that the world I thought I understood was more fragile than I had believed, and that somewhere inside this loud, efficient, indifferent machinery there was room for a human being to be treated as one. I did not know yet what that would cost me, but I knew with a certainty that frightened me more than fear itself that nothing would be the same after this. I did not cry. That is what frightened me most. After the kindness of the day before, I expected something inside me to release, to sob, to shake, to collapse in the way people imagine when a wall finally breaks. Instead, I woke the next morning with my face dry and my chest tight, as if my body had decided that tears were a luxury it could not afford. The noise was already there when we were moved again. Not sudden this time. Not startling. It waited for us steady and patient, like something that had never stopped and never would. The machines were awake before we were. The rails hummed softly as if warming themselves. Steam rose in the controlled breaths. Men took their places without urgency, greeting one another with nods that said, "Yesterday happened today, will too." We were led along a path that ran parallel to the work. I thought I was prepared. I was not. From this angle, the process revealed itself completely without gaps or mystery. Animals arrived alive, guided forward by practiced hands. There was no panic in them, only confusion, brief resistance, then compliance. The transition was swift, precise, and irreversible. I watched the moment when life ended and labor began. Hooks descended. Bodies were lifted. Blood drained cleanly, captured, directed, never spilling where it was not meant to go. Nothing pooled, nothing wasted. What could be used moved forward. What could not was diverted elsewhere. The system did not pause. It absorbed everything. I waited for disgust to overwhelm me, for horror to force my eyes away. Instead, what I felt was something colder and far more dangerous: understanding. This was not cruelty. This was efficiency. I followed the path with my eyes as flesh became cuts, as cuts became portions, as portions disappeared into crates stamped with neat lettering. Each crate moved onward, not into darkness, but into order, onto carts, into rail cars, toward destinations already decided. People were fed by this. I thought of Germany. Not the speeches or the flags, but the kitchens. The long lines that curved around blocks, women shifting their weight from one foot to the other, ration cards folded and unfolded until the creases tore. The way my mother used to stand at the table, calculating portions with her eyes alone, deciding who would feel hunger and who would not. I remembered the sound of boiling water without anything in it, the way it hissed and popped, pretending to be soup. The way my mother would drop in a single potato cut into pieces so small they barely deserved the name and call it dinner. Here, nothing pretended. What was produced was real. What was needed was delivered. No one argued about ideology while bodies weakened. No one asked faith to substitute for calories. I felt my breath shorten, but still I did not cry. Later, how much later, I could not say, we were guided to a shaded area where food was being distributed. Not ceremonially, not with any sense that this was a special moment. Just another step in the day. I saw the sandwiches before I understood what they were. Thick slices of bread. Meat stacked between them, still warm juices darkening the paper beneath. Someone nearby inhaled sharply. Another woman turned her head away as if the sight itself were too much. When one was placed into my hands, I almost dropped it. It was heavier than I expected. Solid. Substantial. I held it with both hands, fingers curling around the edges as if I were afraid it might disappear. For a moment, everything else faded. The noise dulled. The movement slowed. The world narrowed to the weight resting in my palms. I did not eat it. I could not. My body remembered hunger too well to trust this. I had learned over years of scarcity that food could be a promise you paid for later. that indulgence invited punishment, that to accept too much was to risk losing everything. I stared at the sandwich as if it were a religious object, something to be approached with caution, reverence, fear. Around me, others hesitated too. A few bit quickly, desperately, as if afraid someone would change their mind. Others did what I did, held, stared, waited. A guard noticed my stillness. She said nothing. She did not urge me to eat. She simply moved on, trusting that I would decide for myself. That trust was unbearable. I closed my eyes and my mother appeared again, older than she had been when I last saw her, thinner. Her hands rough from scrubbing pots that were always empty. I saw her slip me the larger portion when she thought no one was watching, then pretend she was not hungry when I asked why she wasn't eating. I opened my eyes. The sandwich did not change. This meat had not been taken from someone else's mouth. It had not required someone to go without. It existed because a system had decided long before I arrived that feeding people was not optional. I felt something inside me give way, not dramatically, not outwardly. It was as if a support beam I had leaned on, without knowing it had been removed. The belief that suffering was inevitable. The belief that hunger was normal. The belief that deprivation was proof of virtue. None of those things could survive what I was holding. I took a bite. The taste was overwhelming, not because it was exotic, but because it was complete. Salt, fat, warmth. My jaw ached as I chewed, unused to the effort. My stomach tightened, unsure whether to welcome or reject what it received. I forced myself to slow down, to breathe. Halfway through, I stopped again, suddenly afraid. Afraid that if I finished it, I would have to acknowledge what it meant, that I was being fed better here under guard in enemy territory than my family was at home. The thought did not come with anger. It came with shame, not for eating, but for everything I had believed, for every report I had typed that spoke of resilience while people starved, for every excuse made in the name of endurance. I swallowed hard. My hands trembled, and finally tears pressed at the back of my eyes. They did not fall. They stayed there burning, because crying would have been simpler. Crying would have meant release. This was something else. This was the collapse of a story I had lived inside for years. Around me, the work continued. Crates moved. Trains arrived. The sandwich in my hands grew lighter as I ate, not because it was disappearing, but because its meaning was settling in. I understood then that the danger I had feared was real, but not in the way I expected. I was not going to be broken by cruelty. I was going to be broken by comparison. By the knowledge that another way had existed all along. That a country could choose to organize itself so thoroughly, so deliberately that even its enemies did not go hungry. I finished the sandwich. I wiped my hands, carefully folding the paper with the same precision my mother used when she saved scraps for later. Habit does not vanish just because circumstances change. As we were led away, my legs felt weak, but my back remained straight. I did not want anyone to mistake what I felt for gratitude alone. It was more than that. It was grief for the years lost to believing that suffering was noble. For the people who had starved under slogans. For the parts of myself that had accepted less because I did not know more was possible. I did not cry, but something inside me had ended. And something else unwanted, undeniable, had begun. The question came to me unexpectedly. It did not arrive with anger or accusation. It came quietly, almost politely, as we were moved once more through the routine of the camp. The realization from the day before still sat heavy in my chest, but it had changed shape. It was no longer shock or admiration alone. It was comparison. I found myself looking at everything now through a double lens, what I was seeing and what I knew it would one day become. The buildings here were new, but already they felt permanent. The rail lines were polished by use, not age. The people moved with the confidence of those who expected their work to matter tomorrow as much as it did today. And suddenly, without warning, I wondered what this place would look like decades from now. Not ruined, not abandoned, but changed. That thought unsettled me more than anything that had come before. During the war, America felt whole. I could see it in the way strangers cooperated without being told. In the way factories, farms, unions, and families pointed in the same direction without needing slogans to hold them together. Everyone seemed to understand the assignment, even if they argued about the details. The work was not glamorous. It was not heroic in the way posters depicted heroism. It was repetitive, exhausting, often thankless. And yet, it carried a sense of shared purpose that I had not seen anywhere else. No one here asked whether the war was worth it while the work was being done. That question, I sensed, belonged to later years, to peacetime, to memory, to distance. In 1944, the answer was assumed we do this so that tomorrow exists. I compared this to Germany, and the contrast was painful. We spoke endlessly of unity, but lived fragmentation, of destiny, but practiced improvisation. Our factories were targets, our rail lines broken. Our farms drained without being sustained. We demanded sacrifice without building systems that honored it. Here, sacrifice was distributed. No one escaped it, but no one carried it alone. I began to understand that unity was not an emotion. It was an infrastructure. And infrastructure, once neglected, did not simply return. That realization pulled my thoughts forward beyond the war, beyond my captivity into a future I could only imagine. I wondered what would happen when this unity no longer had an enemy to define it. When the machines slowed, when the urgency faded. Would the factories still hum? Would the rail lines still connect people instead of dividing them? Would Americans still recognize one another as part of the same effort? The thought frightened me, because I had seen what happened when that recognition failed. In Germany, the loss had been gradual. First trust eroded, then cooperation, then the belief that everyone was working toward the same end. By the time the bombs fell, the collapse had already begun inside kitchens and councils and boardrooms. Here, in 1944, that collapse felt unimaginable, and yet I could not ignore the question forming quietly beneath my admiration. If this country could organize itself to feed its enemies during a war for survival, what would it do with that power when the war ended? As days passed, I noticed small signs of tension even then. A worker grumbling about wages, a guard muttering about rationing at home, a disagreement over schedules that lingered longer than it needed to. These were not cracks not yet, but they were reminders that unity was a choice, not a permanent state. Still, compared to what I had known, the contrast remained overwhelming. America during the war felt like a single organism, diverse, noisy, with others who had learned to fold their memories carefully the way you fold a letter you might one day have to unfold in front of strangers. The Atlantic was gray and indifferent. We were lighter than when we had crossed it before, not just in body but in certainty. I did not know what waited for me in Germany. I only knew what I was leaving behind. Chicago did not follow me home, but pieces of it did. Germany after the war was a landscape of pauses. Rubble waited to be cleared. Streets waited to be named again. People waited for food, for news, for forgiveness. I found my mother thinner than memory allowed her hair more gray than I had prepared myself for. We embraced without words. We cooked with what we had. We learned to live in the space between hunger and hope. I did not talk about the war, not the bombs, not the trains, not the uniforms. Those details felt heavy, sharp, and unhelpful. When neighbors asked, I said only that I had been away and that I had come back. But sometimes when the kettle boiled and the room filled with steam, I spoke of other things. I spoke of a man in a sweat-darkened shirt who handed me a cup of water and walked away as if that was the most natural thing in the world. Of a woman who fastened a button without asking permission. Of a voice that said calmly, "You'll be fine. It's just loud." I spoke of bread that was thick enough to hold weight. Of meat that did not require apology. Of a sandwich I held with both hands and did not eat right away because I was afraid of what it meant. My mother listened. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she nodded once and said, "Then you were lucky." She was right. I built a life after that quiet, ordinary, stubbornly forward-looking. I married. I worked. I learned which memories needed air and which needed silence. I raised children who asked questions I could not always answer. I did not tell them about the war, but I told them about a country where trains ran on time because people believed they should. About workers who fed strangers without demanding gratitude. About an enemy who did not need to humiliate to win. When my children grew older, they asked why I spoke of those moments and not of others. I told them the truth as best I could, that some memories teach you how to survive and others teach you how to live. Years passed, then decades. The world changed its clothes and called it progress. Factories closed. Others moved. Words like efficiency and global replaced words like neighbor and home. I watched from a distance, careful not to confuse nostalgia with understanding. One afternoon, long after my hands had begun to shake and my steps had shortened, my granddaughter asked me what it had been like to be a prisoner. I surprised us both by answering. I told her I had been afraid, that I had believed lies because they had been repeated often and loudly, that I had expected cruelty and found routine instead. That the most powerful thing I witnessed was not force, but restraint. She listened, then said very softly, "They didn't have to do that." "No," I said, "they chose to." That night, after she left, I thought of the people whose names I never learned, the workers who would never know what they're imperfect but coordinated. Industry did not compete with agriculture. It depended on it. Labor did not sabotage management. It negotiated with it. People argued, but they showed up anyway. I wondered what it would feel like to live in a country where showing up was still assumed. And I wondered dangerously perhaps whether that assumption would survive peace. The question that followed was sharper, more uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. If Americans could extend decency to prisoners women like me wearing the uniform of an enemy, why would they ever withhold it from one another? I had no answer, only the unease of someone who had seen both abundance and collapse and recognized how thin the line between them could be. That line was not drawn by ideology or borders, it was drawn by memory. As long as people remembered what it took to build this, remembered the factories running day and night, the women balancing ledgers and families, the farmers sending their best instead of hiding it, perhaps the unity would last. But memory fades. Comfort dulls urgency. And without an enemy to force cooperation, the work of staying connected becomes harder, not easier. I watched American guards joke with one another, argue about baseball teams, complain about the heat. They were human, not symbols. Someday, I knew they would return home and speak of this time as a chapter closed. I wondered what they would tell their children. Would they speak of shared purpose? Of neighbors pulling together? Of a country that functioned because people believed it should? Or would they speak only of battles and victory, forgetting the quieter triumph that made those victories possible, standing there an enemy under guard? I felt a strange sense of responsibility settle on me. I would remember this even if they did not. I would carry the image of a nation at work feeding not just itself, but its enemies operating without spectacle or cruelty. And one day when the world had changed again as it always does, I suspected Americans would look back to this moment not with certainty, but with longing. Longing for a time when disagreement did not erase belonging, when industry meant pride, not nostalgia, when the idea of a home front meant something tangible and shared. The war would end. The machines would slow. The unity would be tested, but the memory of what America had been capable of, what it chose to be under pressure, would remain waiting to be rediscovered. As we were dismissed for the evening, that thought stayed with me. If they had once been this generous, this disciplined, this humane, then perhaps the question was not whether America could be that way again, but whether it would remember why it ever was. The war ended without asking my permission. One morning, the routine stopped shifting, and the guards' voices carried a different weight, not relief exactly, but release. Orders were shorter. Faces softened. We stood in lines that no longer felt temporary, waiting not for the next task, but for the next life. I thought the end would arrive with noise, with shouting, with celebration, with the kind of spectacle that history prefers. Instead, it came quietly. I was put on a ship. Months later, a long small kindnesses had done, and the guards who followed rules without turning them into weapons. The society that fed its enemies because it had decided long before the war that hunger was not a tool to be used. I wondered how many families like mine existed because of that choice. When I am gone, my children will likely remember little of what I said. Stories thin as they pass through generations. But some things survive because they attach themselves to identity, not narrative. My grandchildren will know this, that their family came from a place that collapsed, but was sustained by a place that did not retaliate. They will know that mercy is not weakness when it is practiced at scale. They will know that history is written in victories, but lives are shaped by something else entirely. Once my granddaughter wrote a sentence for school and brought it to me asking if it sounded right. It did. Years later, when she asked me again what mattered most about that time, I repeated it to her unchanged. History remembers who won the war, but my family remembers who showed mercy.